In 2022, the European Union banned a food additive used to make candy, frosting, and countless other processed foods look bright and opaque white. The additive is called titanium dioxide, listed on European ingredient panels as E171, and the European Union's Food Safety Authority concluded it could no longer rule out that the substance might damage human DNA. That same year, in the United States, a class action lawsuit was filed against Mars, the maker of Skittles, alleging the company knew titanium dioxide posed a health risk and failed to warn consumers. The lawsuit cited much of the same underlying research the European Union had used to justify its ban. The case didn't go the way you might expect, and the story of what happened next tells you almost everything about how differently the United States and the European Union handle a genuinely uncertain piece of food science. Let's start with what titanium dioxide actually is and why it's in your food at all. It's a naturally occurring mineral, mined and processed into an extremely fine white powder, and it's been used across a huge range of industries for over a century. And it is the primary ingredient responsible for the opacity and brightness in most white paint. And it's also used in sunscreen as a physical UV blocking agent, in toothpaste, in pharmaceutical tablet coatings, and in food, where its job is purely cosmetic. It makes the white parts of a product look bright, opaque, and uniform, rather than translucent or dull. It's in powdered donuts, cake frosting, coffee creamer, chewing gum, and a wide range of candy, including the white and light-colored pieces in Skittles. It is worth understanding just how deeply embedded titanium dioxide is in the modern food supply before getting into the safety question itself, because its ubiquity is part of why this particular ban was such a significant undertaking for manufacturers to comply with. Unlike a niche ingredient used in one or two product categories, titanium dioxide's job, making a white or light-colored product look bright, opaque, and visually consistent from batch to batch, applies across an enormous swath of the packaged food industry, and reformulating away from it is not as simple as swapping one preservative for another. Natural white pigment alternatives, like certain starches or calcium carbonate, generally cannot fully replicate titanium dioxide's opacity and brightness at comparable cost and shelf stability, which is part of why the EU ban in 2022 triggered a genuinely difficult reformulation scramble across the confectionery and baking industries, with some smaller EU manufacturers reporting they simply accepted a less visually uniform product rather than finding a fully equivalent replacement. The safety question centers on particle size. Titanium dioxide used in food contains a mixture of particle sizes, and a portion of that mixture falls into the nanoparticle range, particles small enough that some researchers have raised concern about whether they can cross biological barriers in the body more easily than larger particles would, potentially reaching the bloodstream, and in animal studies accumulating in organs including the liver and spleen after long-term exposure. In 2021, the European Food Safety Authority published a formal reassessment of titanium dioxide as a food additive, and its conclusion was notably direct. EFSA stated that titanium dioxide could no longer be considered safe as a food additive because, based on the available evidence, a concern for genotoxicity, that is, potential damage to genetic material, could not be ruled out. It is worth being precise about what EFSA actually said, because this gets oversimplified constantly in online coverage. EFSA did not conclude that titanium dioxide definitively causes cancer or genetic damage in humans at typical dietary exposure levels. It concluded that the evidence was not sufficient to rule that possibility out with confidence, and under the EU's precautionary framework, that absence of a clean safety conclusion was itself sufficient grounds to remove the additive from the approved list. The ban took effect across the EU in August 2022. In the United States, the FDA's position has remained that titanium dioxide is safe for use in food at current permitted levels, a conclusion the agency has held since originally approving the additive decades ago and has not revised despite the EU's 2021 reassessment. The FDA's public position, consistent with how it has responded to several of the divergent EU rulings we have covered on this channel, is that the available toxicological evidence does not meet the FDA's own bar for establishing a safety concern requiring action, and that EFSA's more precautionary standard for what counts as sufficient uncertainty to justify a ban is a different regulatory philosophy, not necessarily a more scientifically correct one. This is where the Skittles lawsuit comes in, because it is a genuinely useful window into how a safety dispute like this actually gets tested inside the US legal system in real time, rather than through EFSA-style expert regulatory review. The lawsuit, filed in California in 2022, argued that Mars had continued using titanium dioxide in Skittles despite the EU's action and despite the company's own past public statements made years earlier, expressing intent to phase out titanium dioxide across its global product lines, a commitment Mars had made around 2016 in response to earlier consumer pressure, but which the lawsuit alleged had not been fully carried through, at least in US products. The suit sought a court order requiring warning labels or reformulation, built substantially around the same EFSA genotoxicity findings that had driven the European ban. In 2023, a federal judge dismissed the case. The core of the dismissal was not a ruling that titanium dioxide is definitely safe, and courts generally are not in the business of resolving open scientific questions themselves. It was a ruling that the plaintiffs had not sufficiently shown that Mars's use of titanium dioxide at the levels present in Skittles violated any specific U.S. safety standard or made a false or misleading claim under California consumer protection law, given that the ingredient remains legally permitted by the FDA at current levels. In other words, because the FDA has not withdrawn approval, a company using the ingredient within limits permitted by the FDA has a strong legal defense against exactly this kind of claim, almost regardless of what a foreign regulator has separately concluded. The plaintiff's attorneys indicated they intended to pursue an amended complaint, but the core dynamic the case revealed holds regardless of its ultimate outcome. U.S. litigation is a genuinely weak substitute for the kind of centralized pre-market safety authority EFSA exercises directly, because a lawsuit has to fit into existing legal causes of action, not simply relitigate a scientific safety question from first principles. Here's where this connects directly back to something we covered several videos ago on the bread additive potassium bromate, because titanium dioxide's United States story took an unexpected turn at the state level that mirrors it almost exactly. In October 2023, California passed the California Food Safety Act, also known as Assembly Bill 418, becoming the first United States state to ban specific food additives outright at the state level, rather than just requiring a warning label the way Proposition 65 does. The law banned 4 substances from any food manufactured, sold, or offered for sale in California, effective 2027: brominated vegetable oil, potassium bromate, the same bread additive from our earlier video, propylparaben, and red dye. Number 3, titanium dioxide was actually included in an earlier draft of the bill, but was removed before final passage following industry lobbying and some internal disagreement over how strong the underlying genotoxicity evidence really was, even among legislators who supported the bill's other 3 restrictions. So titanium dioxide remains legal even in California, while 3 other substances we've either already discussed or that share a similar regulatory profile are now on a path to state-level prohibition. This is genuinely one of the more interesting recent developments in this whole space, because it represents something new: individual U.S. states beginning to functionally import EU-style precautionary standards into American law, one substance and one legislative fight at a time, rather than waiting for the FDA to act at the federal level. Since California is such a large single market, a state-level ban like this frequently pushes national reformulation anyway, the same way California's Prop 65 disclosure requirements have historically influenced nationwide labeling and formulation decisions even for products sold outside California, simply because manufacturers often find it more efficient to reformulate once for the whole country than maintain a separate California-specific product line. So where does this leave titanium dioxide specifically right now? Banned across the EU since 2022 based on an inability to rule out genotoxicity risk. Legal under federal US law, with the FDA maintaining its existing safety position. Survived a direct legal challenge in the Skittles case built on the EU's own findings, and notably absent from California's new state-level food additive ban, despite bromate, red dye 3, and 2 other substances making the cut in that same law, which tells you the debate over titanium dioxide's actual risk level remains more genuinely contested, even within US regulatory and legislative circles, than some of the other substances we've covered. There is a detail here that makes this story more genuinely uncertain than most of what we have covered on this channel, and it is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. EFSA is not the only major international body that has reviewed titanium dioxide, and the others have not reached the same conclusion. The Joint FAO-WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, generally known as JECFA, the international body that sets global food additive safety reference points used by dozens of countries as a baseline, reviewed titanium dioxide separately and did not reach EFSA's conclusion that genotoxicity concerns were serious enough to withdraw approval. This is a case where 2 respected independent expert scientific bodies looked at substantially overlapping evidence and landed in different places, not because one of them is compromised or politically influenced, but because assessing the significance of genuinely ambiguous nanoparticle toxicology data involves real scientific judgment calls about how much uncertainty is too much, and reasonable experts have disagreed on exactly that question. That disagreement shows up in an even more striking place, the United Kingdom itself. Since Brexit, the UK's Food Standards Agency has had the independent authority to diverge from EU food regulations rather than automatically adopting them, and titanium dioxide became one of the clearest examples of that divergence actually happening. The UK's Food Standards Agency and Food Standards Scotland reviewed the same EFSA assessment that drove the EU's 2022 ban and concluded that the existing evidence did not support removing titanium dioxide from the UK's approved additive list, keeping it legal in the UK even as it became illegal across the rest of the EU just across the English Channel. For a channel built around the idea that EU and UK standards are usually aligned, this is one of the clearest counterexamples we have found, proof that EU standard and UK standard aren't automatically the same thing anymore, and that post-Brexit UK regulators are willing to make an independent call, even when it means keeping a substance legal that Brussels has already prohibited. It's also worth finishing the Mars story properly, because the company's own public position adds another layer. Back in 2016, Mars announced a global pledge to remove artificial colors, including titanium dioxide, from its entire human food portfolio worldwide, a commitment covering brands well beyond just Skittles. Progress on that pledge has been slow and uneven across different product lines in different countries, which is part of what the 2022 lawsuit specifically pointed to, arguing the company had made a public commitment years earlier that its own US products had not fully caught up to, independent of what the FDA required. Mars has stated it continues working toward reformulation across its portfolio, though the company has not committed to a specific date for full removal from its US products, and titanium dioxide remains listed on Skittles ingredient panels in the US as of this video. There is a wider pattern worth naming before we wrap up, because titanium dioxide is a genuinely useful case study for something that applies across nearly every video in this series. Notice how different this story is from the bread additive video, where potassium bromate had a clean, internationally consistent verdict, banned across dozens of countries based on a World Health Organization classification. Most major regulatory bodies treat it similarly. Titanium dioxide does not have that kind of consensus. EFSA banned it. JECFA did not flag the same level of concern. The FDA maintained its existing approval. The UK, despite otherwise tracking closely with EU food regulation, explicitly reviewed the same evidence and chose not to follow the EU's ban. Even California, willing to prohibit bromate, red dye 3, and 2 other substances in the same 2023 law, left titanium dioxide off that list after internal debate. That is not a regulatory system failing to do its job. It is 5 different expert bodies looking at a genuinely ambiguous body of nanoparticle toxicology evidence and landing in 5 slightly different places, which is a more honest picture of how food safety science actually works at the edges of current knowledge than the clean banned versus legal framing most content in this space defaults to. Practically, if you want to check for it yourself, titanium dioxide will appear on an ingredient list, either by name or as E171 on any product formulated for EU sale. In the US, it is required to be listed on the ingredient panel by name if used, so it is not hidden. Check any bright white or opaque light-colored candy, gum, frosting, or coffee creamer specifically for titanium dioxide in the ingredient list, keeping in mind that its presence reflects current unchanged FDA approval, not a labeling gap or an oversight, and that even within Europe, banned is not quite as universal a verdict as it first appears. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including EFSA's 2021 titanium dioxide reassessment, JECFA, the FDA guidance, California Assembly Bill 418, and public court records from ongoing litigation. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not legal or medical advice. Regulations, pending legislation, and litigation outcomes change over time, so always check current official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by Mars Incorporated or any other brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're covering a food dye that took the US 35 years longer than Europe to finally ban, red dye number 3, and the surprisingly recent 2025 decision that finally caught America up. Subscribe if you want to see exactly what took so long.